It is so good to see each and every one of you, and I'm glad that you're here, and I appreciate so much the work that is going on here at Milestone, the elders and the efforts that they're making and guiding and all those that are involved in the schools, the teachers. I was sitting there a moment ago listening to Jared, and how proud I am of him and the job that he does. It just chokes me up to listen to him because I remember him when he was here, and listening to him now and seeing the job that he does. This is the caliber of people that come forth from places like this, and it makes you feel good as an old preacher now to be able to know that there are others that come around and be able to handle the job. We don't have to worry so much about it when we're gone and out of the way. But it's so good to be part of this. I appreciate the theme. I've enjoyed it immensely. We think about a little bit of the history for the moment, and we're talking more when you take it into consideration for just a moment, the obvious. We think about the history, it's not really of the church per se. It's kind of the offshoot from that, because the history of the church kind of goes off into oblivion a bit. And we're looking more at the history of the things that have come as a result of the departures. And so as we not go through and make the same mistakes that have been made in the past, so that we might maintain the purity of the church that has been restored. So that's kind of how the way that the study itself has gone. And it needs to focus upon things of that nature. I'm particularly proud of the subjects been given to me, because it becomes a little bit easier when you take into account the other subjects that have been assigned. Because everything else that has to do with Roman Catholicism is basically covered in concepts of history. You talk about the ecumenical councils, the ecumenical movements, and all of that. That's been presented to us from a historical standpoint. There's going to be a lesson that's going to be talking about the popes, and so that's an historical viewpoint. There are other things that we've already covered from that perspective. So it's rather nice to be able to look at it from the standpoint of just the introduction of Roman Catholicism. I like the idea because of the way that it's framed. Just the title of the lesson itself has a wonderful frame to it in this aspect. Let me illustrate it this way. Let's suppose that there is a friend of mine. We are associates ourselves, and he's taking me to an individual that I have not known before, and he's going to introduce me to this individual that he knows. As we come together, the one here with whom we have this common association is going to tell this person, he's going to tell me what this person's name is. And it'll be vice versa. He's going to tell him what my name is. At this particular point in time, the only thing that we know about each other are our names. Now, I, at that particular point, might be able to make an assessment of the individual when I see him, based upon how he may be dressed. When I hear him talk, I might be able to have some assessment of what kind of thinking he possesses, what kind of individual he may be, based upon what I hear from him, and vice versa with myself. In the interaction that we have with one another over a period of time, I may be able to learn more about that individual. It might be also the case that my friend might be able to tell this individual what has brought about the association between us two. He's going to tell him a little bit about me and about a little bit about my history. Therefore, after having done that, it is a bit more than just the introduction by name. He's going to know a little bit about my personal history, and then he might be able to frame some idea in his mind as exactly what kind of person I may be, as to whether he wants to continue that association or not. Now, most of us, as has already been determined, we know the Roman Catholic Church primarily by name, because that's just about as much as the introduction that a lot of us have to it. Now, those others have done the history and have studied the history and know more in depth about what it is. Our perception of Roman Catholicism has primarily been provided to us by the news. We know a little bit about when the Pope comes here. When the Pope comes to America, the media is all over it. They stand around and waited with bated breath about every place that he's going to be. They have his itinerary. Know every place that he's going to go, when he's coming off, what words that he's going to say, when he stands before the throngs and provides his oration, and there's the wisdom that's going to come forth from his mouth. And they just stand there awestruck about everything that he says, because after all, he's the leader of 7 or 8 million people. So we watch that. Then we hear about it when he dies. You know, I've known a number of great gospel preachers, and I don't believe the media has ever covered any of them. They deserve a lot more coverage than this fellow. And yet every time when one of them dies, then of course it is the mass media that covers that. And then they've got to go to the Vatican and they stand around with the other masses of people as they wait for the little puff of smoke to come out of the little chimney, waiting for the white one. And just as soon as that takes place, and then all the elation that comes around, and then after a bit, then the introduction of the next pope. We see all of that. That is about the size of our knowledge of Roman Catholicism. If it's not only that, then you will also see on occasion, as it was, about 30 years ago, there was the sex scandals. I think had been brought up in some of the other lectures as well. And not only that, I think, 7, 8, 10 years ago, there was another. When there were others that were involved with the little boys. And that one was rather traumatic, if I recall. Because I remember after this, if my recollection is true, that they lost many of their parishioners. A lot of people began to leave the Catholic Church. They lost tons of money. That got their attention. And this is something from that particular point till now, they have sought to regain the trust of those that they have lost. We hear about that. What we're dealing with is an organization that has a very weak spiritual base. I'm not certain as to whether a fact that it ever had begun on that weak of a premise. I'm of the opinion that they are trying and had been trying through the times of its initial organizations, trying to establish some way to make maybe people more spiritual minded by their own decrees, ever how that might have been done. But it hasn't been achieved. I have lived in places where there were high concentrations of Catholics. I remember on one occasion when we lived in West Mississippi, I think I was about 11 or 12 years old. The area in which I lived was highly populated with these people. They basically ran the town. When I go to school, there's a fight at school nearly every day involving somebody out of the Catholic Church. These people would steal you blind. I learned even as a student at that age what these people were doing. I would take the things that belonged to me and I would carve my initials, not write them. I would carve my initials in them and they would still steal them. You take this information to a teacher whose name was not Italian. I would go to that particular teacher and tell them, these people have stolen my materials. It's got my initials on them. And he would look at me and go, he understands that dealing with these people, he has no choice but just to leave them alone. They ran things. They were cover for each other. I learned at that particular point in time how they deal with the law. They basically ran it as well. They could steal up to $50 because at that particular point in time, stealing up to $50 was a misdemeanor. If you stole over $50, that's a felony and you had to confess. Less than that, you didn't have to. So they would steal little things and just steal you blind. This is something that was just one of my experiences in understanding the weak spiritual base of this organization. But that was just a very simple thing. Some of the things that have already been pointed out by Brother David and some of the others. As you'll also see, I'm sure, with the discussion of some of the other popes, this is something that has gone all the way up the line and all the way back through history. I just thought about bringing just a couple or three examples of those that have been popes and the kind of behavior that they exhibited. Now, one example is that of Sergius III. He's an individual that had ordered the murder of his predecessor. He had a mistress, had a son by that mistress, who eventually would become Pope John the 9th or the 11th, Pope John the 11th. That's an irony. Then you've got, Benedict the 9th. He was accused of all kinds of rapes, adulteries, orders of murders. He ends up being expelled from Rome, as I understand it. And then later, when the Pope that has now in the position, this Benedict is going to somehow by bribery buy his way back into the papacy, because this fellow that is in it is willing to sell it to him, because Benedict is supposed to have repented, but evidently he didn't. And he ends up being excommunicated from the Catholic Church. A fellow went by the name of Alexander the Sixth. Oh, you go through a whole list of these. It's just some of the ones that I read, if all the information is true. Alexander the Sixth is one who had 7 illegitimate children. I guess it's from some of those housemates that Brother David was talking about. He probably had several of them. He probably had a clean house. Nevertheless, there were 7 illegitimate children. Now, this just gives you an idea from those at the top level in Roman Catholicism. This is going to translate itself all the way down through the laity into those among the parishioners. And that's the reason why I was able to see, even at a young age, the weak spiritual base that these people have. It is an organization, in my estimation, that is one of the most devious of all political powers. And make no mistake about it, that's exactly what it is. Again, I'm not certain as the fact is that was its original intent. But I do believe that after some time, we're able to see that the popes had garnered some power among leaders of nations, because the leaders of nations sought their counsel, and they would seek their approval for certain actions that they would take. You will find, if you go through a study of the history of areas of Europe where there would be conflicts that would occur between nations and kings, biggest portion of the time, if not exclusively to all of it, you're going to find the Pope involved in every one of them. Somehow or the other, a Pope's going to be involved. The Catholic Church is going to be involved in those national conflicts. Not to mention those that had continued even through the periods of the Crusades and the like, where the Catholic Church is going to try to exercise its power over nations of men. Well, this is something that has been an organization that has sought this universal power. The name Catholic's not in the Bible. If you get into discussion with some Catholics, they're going to make the claim that it is, however. I have seen that. I have evidence of that. I'm sure that many of you do as well. Now, the word Catholic, of course, meaning universal or all. And so they're going to argue based upon the commission of the Lord and the gospel records. Go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature, go teach all nations. Matthew 28. Jesus made the statement in John 12, and I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me. Their claim is as a result, this is what it was that Jesus wanted. We're only part of that which Jesus made. It is a universal church, therefore Catholic is there. Now the church is supposed to be a universal thing. God intended for all the world to hear the gospel. Isaiah had prophesied that all nations would flow into it. It had that original intent. But somehow or another, I have difficulty in assessing the view or accepting the view that Isaiah, when he made his prophecy concerning the name in Isaiah chapter 62, that it would be something that would include what was found by the writing of Luke in Acts 11 concerning the disciples that were at Antioch, that they were there first called Catholic. I have difficulty in assessing that that be the case, because I know that that's not the term. The disciples were called Christians, and then they're going to argue, well, wait a minute, we're maybe Catholic, but we're Christians too. Sorry. That's not the case. You say, well, we're followers of Christ. You have a strange definition of what a disciple is. If I were to ask each one of you what a disciple would be, you would tell me what? A follower. If I were to ask you what a disciple of Christ would be, how would you respond? Follower of Christ. What does it mean to be a follower of Christ? Just to say, I believe in Him? Think on that just a moment, because one of the other definitions that's used in context with this is that the word also included universal. Look up that word. Having to do with all men, or that which is accepting of all inclusive. When you take into account the ranks of Roman Catholicism even today, and as it has been for many years, that's been brought to our attention during the course of the week. There are elements that exist within the Catholic Church that are in opposition one to the other. It is not much different than what you find in many other denominations that do exist. There is what you might call the liberal movement. And then there are those that are more conservative among the ancient hardliners. There was some row that they had in the selection of this last pope. What's his name? Francis? In this last one, they were concerned, some of the hardliners were concerned about his selection because of his liberal views. But it's still the fact that those that are more of the ancients are keeping a little bit more of the line of the ancient views, the hardline views, because he hasn't at this particular point been able to uproot every fundamental concept that is found in Roman Catholic orthodoxy. But then there are those among the Catholics that are dissatisfied with that. And that's the reason why they have departed, such as the reason for the Greek Orthodox, Episcopalians, and many of these who at this present time are a bit more in line with the definition, all-inclusive. And you'll notice that much of the conflict that exists in some of the areas of the Catholic Church is simply because of the fact that some of their leaders are not allowing the women to take part of the clergy. They're not allowing homosexuals to be accepted. And so as a consequence of this, they are leaving and going off to the Episcopals because they are accepting them. And so now you've still got this conflict that exists here, even on the basis of the terminology, on the definition of the word itself. I like this study because what we're doing is we're just introducing the church, Roman Catholicism. And that's what we're going to spend our time trying to do this evening. As a matter of introduction, that means that something about the beginning of this organization is introduced to us within the Scriptures. Because the basic disposition that has brought this about is found there. The Apostle Paul and some of the others were very well aware of the fact that this problem existed, that there was a disposition of some of those that were among their leaders to seek power. Wasn't it Brother Jared that just brought that up? Now, among the elders, this is one of the ironies. To be an elder, as God had established it, and as the Apostle Paul set forth the qualifications. One of the qualifications of being an elder is he'd have to first desire the office, correct? There is a difference between desiring the office of an elder and seeking power. And that's exactly where the problem arises. Because when you start looking at the overview of Roman Catholicism, that is how that it's come about. And we have time, we'll deal with that as we are permitted. But take, for example, just for the moment, the situation with Paul when he's meeting with the Ephesian elders at Miletus, as you'll see back in the 20th chapter of the book of Acts. When he's meeting with them there, he's bringing to their attention the time that he had spent with them. 3 years. Warning you. Night and day with tears. That was an intense concern that he had with what was going to go on with them in the brotherhood. I can only imagine that. Because he evidently has some sense of knowledge by inspiration, because he speaks prophetically. There are going to come some from you that are going to rise up, that are going to enter in among you as grievous wolves. What are they going to do, Paul? They're going to speak perverse things. And for what reason, Paul? To draw away disciples after themselves. These are individuals about whom he speaks that are looking for and seeking power for themselves. The perverse things is not going to be something that would be just exclusive to this movement here. There's an apostasy that is somewhat the spirit of the apostasy he talks about in other places, even dealing with Judaism. Galatians 1, I marvel that you're so soon removed from him that call in the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. So it's not new, not exclusive. And we know that this may be something that's also even taken consideration here, along with the concept of Judaism. But then you go over to 2 Timothy, or 2 Thessalonians rather, chapter 2. And here he's going to begin to talk about, in my estimation, based on I think what other scholars also agree in many areas. Some may have some different views of it. You can have whatever you want. I'm of the view that he's talking about Pope here. That's my view. You want to have some other view, you present it. But I'm looking at this situation here as he's presenting an individual with the descriptions that are found here that give us every indication of that which coincides with what we know about him. The people at Thessalonica, the brethren there, were being beset by several different errors. And one of them, evidently, somebody had been telling them that the Lord's coming was imminent. So you better get ready. So many of them did. Based on some things that I had read, many of these people began to sell the things that they possessed. They would take their families and head off. They wanted to make sure they'd be first in line when the Lord came back, so they'd go to top of hills and mountains. So when the Lord came back, they would be first in line. They'd go on top of the rooftops and things of this nature. Well, as time continues to go by, their resources are running out. They began to sponge off some of the other brethren and getting their nose into places where they shouldn't be. Some of the others were beginning to help them. And Paul said, don't you do that. These people need to be about their own business. In chapter 3, if man don't work, shouldn't eat. He needs to get back to his own responsibilities. We jump back to chapter 2. Why is that the case? Because you can be confident in that, he says, brethren. Because the Lord's coming is not going to be something that will take place until there is first a falling away. There will be an apostasy. And then he's going to provide for us a description of what's involved in the falling away. And if you'll note the text that's seen in that passage, in verses 3 through 7, You're going to find that he mentions in the text, mentions the fall of the way, and then he's going to talk about what comes in context with it, and that's the man of sin when he will be revealed. That son of perdition. Apoleia, the son of ruin. The son of destruction. Isn't that an ironic concept there? Because you'll notice how he addresses the individual about whom he speaks. Look back up in verse 4. Because he tells us in verse 4, this is the person who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God. Do you notice how that's structured? When you look at the term oppose and exalt, all of this is something that's put in context with God. He opposes God, but he exalts himself above all that's called God, even puts himself in the position as he is God, as he sits in the temple of God. Now, it's not the temple in Jerusalem, mind you. By the time, evidently, this comes about, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. So he comes somewhere. There's a place where he resides. I would suggest that this is somewhat of a preview, is it not, to what you find in the Vatican. These people base their particular positions on the fact that Peter was one who was the bishop of Rome, the first bishop of Rome, died there. Cover that later if we have opportunity. But the basilica there is supposed, as it was built in the 4th century and then rebuilt in the 16th, is supposedly built on top of his tomb. So this is the presumption that they have provided here as the place where in fact this is going to begin, or this is where he is known. This is where he's celebrated. This is how he is, the expression concerning him is made. How is he referenced? How is he celebrated? He's known as the Holy Father. He presents himself as the representative of God on earth, the vicar of Christ. It would be hard-pressed for me to not see that that would be something that's used in this context. Here is the individual that sets himself up as God, referred to as the Holy Father. They expect you to refer to him in such a fashion. And yet he, as you saw on the screen, he's actually in opposition to God, and that's a statement that is made by inspiration. The God of heaven has made it clear through the writing of Paul, whoever that sits in this representation is actually in opposition to me. Is that not somewhat similar to some of the false prophets that lived in the days of Jeremiah? Who ran around and saying that they were claiming to speak for God. You remember what it was that God said? They don't speak for me. I didn't put words in their mouth. And yet these are the very things that these people right here are doing. They've got their own creed. They expect, as has already been pointed out from the manifestations of their ecumenical council notes and books and writings, that these have become the authority that is equal or considered above the Word of God, which is not something new either. Because when you go back and deal with some of those that Jesus dealt with when he was here, this is something you would expect. The Jews were that way, were they not? What was it that some of those Jews stated, the complaint they brought to Christ in Matthew 15? The disciples had not washed their hands before they ate. What was the foundation of the complaint? They were not keeping the tradition of who? The elders. Elders of who? The elders of the Jews. What did Jesus tell them? I'm not so much concerned about the elders. You're not keeping the law of God. There's where the problem was. Now, this man of sin that's requiring here, as is stated by Paul, he'll be revealed in time, but there's a restraining power that's keeping him from being fully revealed. Some questions about and some debate about what the restraining power is. There are those that are of the opinion that it's the Roman Empire. As long as there's a pagan power in Rome, that's going to keep this fanatical religion in check. Now, Rome has always been somewhat concerned about religious fanaticism. They didn't mind so much anything having to do with idol worship, because anybody that followed an idol followed most anything. But they did know, and I am sure of the fact, that those that would have been Caesars would have been familiar with the past history of some of the areas that they had captured. If he has any sense of what the history of the Jews would have been, that there is a zealousness that exists among these people concerning their faith in God. Well, they're going to keep that in check, but then there is the rising of Christianity. This is something that causes them some concern, but they're just watching it. But then there are things that begin to happen that begin to turn the tide. You remember the situation in Acts, the 17th chapter? When Paul had gone to Thessalonica, there was a good response to the gospel that was there. But there were many that did not accept it. And you remember the mob that assaulted the house of Jason? They take him before the rulers. Remember what they told the rulers? These are the people that have turned the world upside down. And what was the language? Saying that there was another king, one Jesus, and they do all to defy the decrees of Caesar. Bingo! Now then, you've got something that's going to draw attention to those that are among the Christians. Because this now poses, in his estimation, the threat. That's the reason why I have a hard time believing that Peter would be spending a great deal of time in Rome, being the first bishop of Rome during the time which these people claim that he was there. Because if the Caesar realizes in the seat of his own throne that there is this zealous movement that is beginning here or is arising from here, do you think that that's going to last any time? I don't think that he would have lasted to the occasion when they claimed that he was crucified in AD 68. That would have been put down, in my estimation, sometime before that. But nevertheless, there are those that are of the opinion that the Roman Empire is that which keeps this in check. Some others are of the opinion, like Brother David Lipscomb, that the restraining power was Paul. And that because of the context of what you're finding there in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And he mentions that the iniquity doth already now work. It's already at work. So Paul, or Brother Lipscomb, states that Paul is in the context. He's putting himself in the context of this, dealing with this issue. But that suggests to me that Paul would be the only one that really would be dealing with it. And that he himself is somewhat elevated above the others. And the fact is that there were other apostles that were still living. Nevertheless, whatever it was, Paul had mentioned it to him before. You know what it is that's restraining this thing from taking place. My particular view is something a little more comprehensive than that, because I think it encapsulates all of it. Because whatever it was, if it was Rome, who would have been behind a lot of it was that took place where the destruction, say, of Jerusalem was? That had been prophesied years before, had it not? Had not God on occasion used nations to bring about discipline of others? What about the situation if it were Paul? What is the force behind Paul if he's the restraining power? The only force that Paul has got is what's given him by inspiration. Is that not right? It seems to me to be more a comprehensive view and a more logical viewpoint that he may be referring to the Spirit. Because when the Spirit's work is done, and he had told the brethren at Corinth that the Spirit's work was going to come to a close. Tongues would cease, prophecies would fail, inspired knowledge done away. When all of that's done, no more revelation, no more spiritual gifts, all of that's over with. If there are those among this apostasy of that disposition and of that movement who are mindful of that situation, when they come to the realization there are no more miraculous powers, there is no more revelation taking place, it seems to me to follow the same rule of thought that happened when the prophets were silenced years before. What happened when the prophets were silenced? Did they not amend and expand and do what they wanted to do with the laws of God when that took place? Did we not talk about the tradition of the elders a moment ago? That's exactly what it was they were doing because they felt the freedom to be able to do so. It seems to me, why would that not be the same situation? When they began to realize that inspiration ceases, this thing takes off. Man of sin is not held back anymore. You have to wonder now again, if you're going to make the claim that it has to do with the Roman Empire, then you got Constantine comes along at some point in time. He's going to be sympathetic to the movement. The empire itself doesn't fall till 476. This has already begun by that time. So now we begin to look at the situation here. The Spirit, when He comes to a close in His work, now this begins to give the freedom in these people's minds. We're not restrained anymore. And so you begin then to see the search for power. They're looking for the ways to elevate themselves. That brings you to the overview. In these different places throughout the known world at that time, when the churches of our Lord were established, and you had elders in these different congregations that had been placed by Paul and others that had encouraged them to establish elderships in these areas, you're going to eventually, as you well know from the study of it, there's going to be one that's going to be selected among, here's a congregation that has 5 elders, and there's going to be one that's going to be selected to somewhat oversee the rest of them. Congregation over here is going to have 3. You're going to have one that's going to be elevated above, whether he sought the power or has been put in that position. And eventually, as then, their prominence is going to be determined by the prominence of the city in which they live. The most prominent of the cities during that time, of course, is Rome. You go to Constantinople, then Alexandria, and then you got places like Ephesus and Jerusalem, Antioch, some of these others. And then once they all get together, have their councils, and then somebody's going to be elevated here. And then once that authority is established, then there is the beginning of the edicts, which begin to be set down for all of those that are supposed to be the followers. And it would be that way until the time that Martin Luther has decided enough's enough. And then you have the time of the Reformation. And during that period, of course, there is the conflict that exists between Catholicism and everybody else. And then when you get through some years when there are the break-offs one after the other to all the different denominations, it finally comes to the point that Catholicism begins to realize we're not going to be able to stop this flow. So their disposition, based upon what I have read from it, it really doesn't make any difference to them because the church is universal. Therefore, all of those that accept Christ are really Catholic. That's basically how they view it. So it gets back to the definition. That's how they think of it. And yet, every bit of it that we're seeing in the context of the study is that which is a departure from God's way. I wanted to look at this quote that I provided for you in your book that comes from J.W. Shepherd in his book, The Church, the Falling Away, and the Resurrection. Where here he's quoting from Ecclesiastical History, Volume 1. And this is what he says. Now this goes back to what I was talking about a moment ago. When you start talking about timeline of events, when in fact you start to see things that begin to set up the circumstances ripe for the establishment and the revelation of the man of sin. You start looking at this statement right here. By the 2nd century. The church had digressed so far from the original pattern that each congregation would have one bishop over it and other elders submitting to his authority. And then he notes the confederation of the congregations which consolidated into councils and enact the laws and claim the authority from Christ to dictate to the people. And their opinion is they had the right to do that. And again, all of this being based upon the premise that Peter was its first. He had to be the first bishop of Rome and would serve in the position of the first pope, or when you look at it from the standpoint of the first bishop, from 43 to 68 AD when he would be crucified upside down. I say that's a little problematic for me, because I take into account the fact you go back to Acts the 12th chapter when Herod had Peter imprisoned. You remember that scene? You remember that time? Herod had him in prison. Shortly thereafter, you remember what Herod did. He comes out on his portico one morning. He's wearing his silver cape. And he walks out on his portico meeting the morning sun, as Josephus describes it. And when the sun hits him, he just lights up like a candle. He offers up this oration to which the people respond, the voice of a God and not of man. And since Herod did not dispute it, the Bible says that Herod was stricken with worms and died. Now, Josephus said he didn't die immediately. Josephus said that he bent over and doubled over and his servants carried him inside. He lived for 5 days until the worms ate him from inside out. He was 54 years old. But that took place, Josephus said, in AD 44. He had Peter imprisoned shortly before he died. If Peter was in Rome from 43 to 68, he had to leave prison and head back to Rome somehow or another, or there was some intervention at some point in time when the dates just don't match. Fact of the matter is, if it can be proved that Peter was not in Rome, the entire system of Catholicism falls flat on its face. To my knowledge, there is nothing of any substantive proof to suggest that Peter was ever there. Now, he may have been, but there's no proof of it. And I don't know of anything that would suggest that. One of the interesting things about this too, but right before I close, is this. And make the note about Paul's writing to the Romans. Wrote the letter in AD 58. Now that would mean that Peter, if he was there from 43 to 68, he would have been in Rome when Paul writes the letter. In the latter portion of the letter, he sends greetings to 27 people. Now, if Peter is the bishop of Rome, you would think that the Apostle Paul would at least say, hey, Gomer says, hey. And there is no reference to Peter in Rome. He doesn't say it. You know, another little interesting tidbit of information about that? It hit me when I was looking over this. If, in fact, Peter was in Rome at that particular point, and Paul's writing the letter to Rome, and he doesn't get on to Paul for having been the first bishop of Rome, we got a problem with Paul. Because that would also suggest this. The book of 2 Thessalonians was written in about 53 AD. The book of Romans in 58. That would mean sometime between 53 and 58 that the departure or the falling away has taken place, and Peter's the man of sin. And the Apostle Paul, if you don't think he's not going to address that, you're out of your mind. I don't know the man personally. I never did know him. I understand based on tradition he was a small man, about 5'6", with bald head and pockmarked face. That's all I know about him. But I guarantee you the man was wiry enough and was strong enough in the faith, he would have dealt with that situation. But I don't think that there's any foundation for that point, none whatsoever. It amazes me, never ceases to, when people find themselves in error, the effort that they make to justify themselves, and the effort they make to excuse themselves for defending it. Have you ever wondered why they do not debate except for that which you have found with Campbell and Lambert? There may have been a few along the way that I haven't heard about. But, I mean, they're very minor debates that you may have, but among major debates, they don't come around. They're not willing to defend it. They just simply want to impose it. They want to force it on people by the claim of the fact that they are indeed God's representative. And that's it. Forget the Bible. Just listen to what we say. I've thought about that a number of times. And all those fellows that have been selected and referred to as Holy Father, and where they sit this day in torment, and the millions of unfortunate souls that have fallen for this fallacious doctrine. That brings us back to us, doesn't it? We are now reminded of who we are, what our responsibility is, and addressing them and trying to reach them with truth, in spite of the effort that they may not want to hear it. You teach it and preach it anyway, because you never know what might come of it. There may be somebody here tonight not in the kingdom of Christ. The gospel is for you. The gospel is for all, the song says. Jesus wants us to take that gospel to all men. Hear it. Heed it. We sing a song to urge your obedience tonight if you need to. If you love Jesus Christ, you love His Word. Oh, there's not anything that's going to keep you from marching down here, making that known. You'll tell somebody, I'm ready to repent of sin. You will happily confess the name of Christ unto salvation. And you will with all enthusiasm be baptized for the remission of your sins. There's not a thing that would keep you from it. Nobody here is going to keep you from it. It's just you. But perhaps if you have, and you've reproached the Lord by sin, you need to reconcile tonight. While together we stand, while we sing.